I'm Virginia Damback, the Executive Director of the University Station Alliance, and today we are very lucky to have with us Melody Virtue and Amy Lynn from Foster Garvey in Washington, D.C. And while Foster Garvey does a lot of legal work in a lot of areas, Melody and Amy specialize just in broadcast law, and they spend a lot of their time working on FCC renewal prep and primarily with public broadcasters. They have a few commercial stations, but mostly public broadcasters. So I can say with confidence that they know their way in and out of this process and probably have run into every problem there is to have. So Melody, if you would like to,
I'll take it.
You and Amy, just take it and go.
All right. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time out to share with us what you're going to learn about renewals. And the first thing I want to say is that even though you may not yet have filed your renewal that's coming up soon, or you may have already, you're in renewal cycle all the time because you need to be thinking about your renewal for the next, even after it's renewed for the next 8 years, because a lot of this stuff, if you don't take care of it, will come back to haunt you. So one of the things I do want to emphasize is, as university licensees, you need to have your licensee engaged in that process, whether it's for budgeting purposes and planning for the renewal, and then, for that 8-year spike that might happen with getting your renewal on file. And also to understand, because there's always changes in personnel, and when personnel changes, that's when things drop in the regulatory compliance. So we do want to make sure you're focused for that entire 8 years on your renewal. And the rest of this presentation, we will, and I should say next slide, Virginia, where folks are with us.
There we go, I think. Okay, here we go. Sorry.
There we go. So your renewals are 8 years, and like I said, you need to be focused on what those certifications are going to be in your renewal application, because they will affect your renewal, and it's ongoing throughout the whole 8 years. And this time around, it's new for those of you who have done renewal before. It used to be filed in an FCC filing system called CDBS. The FCC has shifted over to a new filing system called LMS, Licensing and Management System. So if we could go to the next slide. So here's another place where people tend to fall down is stations and states file at the same time in individual states. And people think that they need to file their license renewal before the license expires, right? That makes sense. But in fact, they need to file it 4 months before the license expires. So if you see that your license is expiring in December, you need to subtract 4 months and file 4 months before December. So that would be August. So that's coming up in August 2nd because the first is on a weekend. And this is the radio schedule. So when you file depends on what state that your license is licensed to. And then states, we kind of roll around the country with different states filing every other month. So we're busy for years doing renewals, but you may only be focused on your own state. We could go to the next slide. And this is, the last slide was radio. The next slide is for TV. And TV, this makes it more complicated because TV lags behind radio by 1 year. And it can be a little tricky for joint licensees of both radio and TV when it comes to your EEO reporting, because as we'll get into, EEO reporting is a look back for 2 years as part of your renewal process. If we could go to the next slide. So today we're going to cover a variety of things that are relevant to the actual renewal application. As I mentioned before, we're now filing an LMS. That involves filing what used to be the Form 303S, now it's the Schedule 303S. And in addition to that, we have to file an EEO program report, which is the Schedule 396. And we will cover the various certifications that are included in each of these forms as part of this presentation. And also the types of explanations you'll need to make if you cannot, make the certification. And we're having some feedback here for a moment. So, if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy here to get into the specifics of one of the most important features of the renewal this time around.
Thanks, Melody. So yes, as she mentioned, the online public file is one of the most important parts of renewal. That's really one of the first things we look at when we counsel our clients on the renewal process. Just as a little bit of history, the FCC has been transitioning over from the local public file to the online public file. So that began in 2012 with commercial television stations in big markets, and then by the end of 2014 or mid 2014, all TV had transitioned. And then in 2018, everyone else followed radio. And so TV translators are exempt. They don't have online public files. And you don't have a separate public file for multicast program streams. But what it means is now we're in the middle of filing renewals for television stations. And for almost that entire renewal period, the television station had an online public file. And of course, this is an FCC hosted website. And so the FCC can see when were things uploaded, were they late? There's a timestamp, there's a date. It's very clear. If you take something out and delete it and put it back in, all of that's there. And so that becomes really important because the FCC is reviewing your online public file to see if it complies, if you put everything in there on time. And one of the renewal certifications is that you're certifying that everything that should have been in there was in there and is in there, and it was all uploaded on time. And so what happens is a lot of clients will have something late. There are tons and tons of things that need to go in there. And so if you have something late, then you have to certify, no, not everything was in there on time, and then explain why. So the documents that really are most important that I think clients, may run into problems with late uploads most often are the quarterly issues programs lists and the EEO public file reports. So we'll talk about both of those. The quarterly issues programs lists, as all of you know, they're due 10 days after the close of each calendar quarter. So the Q1 report is due April 10th because that's 10 days after the quarter ended on March 31st. Every list has to have specific elements. So it needs to identify the issue. It needs to briefly describe the program. 1-2 sentences is fine. The program that's responsive to the issue. You've got to have the date, the time, and then how long did the program run? Was it 60 seconds? Was it a PSA? Or was it 60 minutes? Was it, some type of news show? And so this is really one of the most important parts of the online public file. This is really where we see licensees get into trouble. So Melody is going to talk a little bit about a couple of examples of when licensees got into trouble.
Next slide. So right out of the gate, just when we started up with radio renewals in June of 19, with the Mid-Atlantic states 2 years ago, in this renewal cycle, there were 2 stations that tripped up. And in both of those, they had problems with their issues programs lists in that they couldn't be found or they couldn't be recreated. And it's kind of a really sad tale of woe. Like one of them was that, they'd gotten counsel and they're going to fix it, but they didn't upload any issues programs list. And in another case, there was this 92-year-old owner of the station, and he had trouble figuring out how to access the public file and couldn't remember if issues programs lists had been prepared. So his adult children had said that they would assist, but they couldn't find the issues programs list, and they would help their father going forward with regulatory compliance. In both cases, the FCC fined each station $15,000 and granted a short-term renewal for 2 years instead of the full 8 years, which meant after 2 years, they would have to file for renewal again. And so I'm going to go to the next slide. So what happened is that, what this tells us is you need to reconstruct. If you can't find, if you've got missing issues programs list, you have to do everything you can to figure out if you can recreate it. It's very, very important to do that. So, because if you don't, you'll get a short-term renewal and a fine. And that may be what your situation is, and you just have to face that, but just don't slough it off because it's too much work. That's not good. So it used to be in prior renewal cycles, when the FCC did not have access to actually view your online public file, that they would have to take the licensee's word for it, and they would self-confess about what happened with their public file, or things were late or missing or had been reconstructed. And it used to be that the baseline forfeiture, if you were missing up to 4 issues programs list, that you got a $3,000 fine. And if you were missing more than that, you got a $10,000 fine. And if there were none prepared, then you would get a short-term renewal and an upward adjustment to that, maybe $14,000 fine per station. So now that the FCC can actually see your online public file, at least on the audio side, the audio division, the FCC has kind of taken, the staff has taken the attitude that they just want to make sure stations know that they have a public file that's online and how to upload things and that it's getting populated. So they've been much more liberal with the fact that, you know, if you've got everything uploaded before you actually hit that file button on your renewal, that they're letting you get processed on time without a fine. And so far, so good, that's holding up. We know we cannot rely on informal staff advice, which this is, but so far it's been working. We've had just this, we use a little short example of, you know, although there's been some administrative oversight and some things weren't uploaded on time, everything in the public file that needs to be in the public file is now there before we file the renewal. And that's been working. I don't know if video is going to go along with that. The video division folks process TV renewals. Sometimes video and audio are not in sync. And initially they were being a little more persnickety about it, particularly since TV was online public file almost 7 years ago already now. So we'll see, but I know, Amy, you've had some experience with this, with some of the early television renewals, and I'll let you chime in there.
Yeah, at first it seemed like video was going to be a little more stringent. The exhibit that Melody mentioned that we just say generally, you know, there were some late uploads, but everything's in there now. The video staff came back to us and said, you know, we want more explanation. And we went to the licensee and the licensee didn't have it. It was really just, you know, we were transitioning, we forgot, here's everything now. And at first it seemed like that wasn't going to work. But then I think after a while, a lot of these were being held up for the same reason. And so then they just started granting them. So far it seems like it's working okay. Sometimes we'll ask clients, do you have a really compelling reason why this was late? And if they don't, then, you know, we use our exhibit and we go with it. But if there is a reason, you know, we'll include it, especially if we think that might be, you know, the staff might hear that and think, oh, okay, sure, that makes sense. There was a question that I'm going to go ahead and answer in the chat, and it's about, this happened to many licensees. The transition to online public file happened in the middle of the license term. For radio, it didn't occur until 2018. So of course, we're going back to 2013, 2014. And yeah, the answer is yes, all of the documents for the entire license term need to be in the online public file. So even if that transition happened in 2018, you've got to have everything going back to the beginning of your license term, whether that was 2013 or whenever you became the licensee. Okay, so the next really important part of renewals is the annual EEO public file reports. These are due on the anniversary of when you file the renewal application. And so if your renewal is due August 2nd this year, your EEO report is actually also due August 1st, but it would be the 2nd because the 1st is a weekend. So you do your annual EEO report every year, and then you do your renewal every 8 years. And so when your renewal happens, you also have an annual EEO report due at the same time. This applies to stations with 5 or more full-time employees. So if you have fewer than that, you don't need to prepare this report. The report gets uploaded to the online public file. And assuming you had 5 or more full-time employees, you'd have 8 for the whole license term. The other piece that also needs to go into the online public file that's related to EEO are audits. The FCC randomly audits 5% of stations. And so if you are one of the ones that gets audited, they'll send you a letter and then you respond to the letter. And then they send you a clearance letter that says, all right, you passed the audit. And those 3 documents, their letter, your response, and then their clearance letter, those all need to go into the online public file as well. Next slide, please. All right, so the EEO report has 2 separate sections that both need to be in this report. The first is on hiring, and the second is on outreach initiatives. Hiring, of course, you have to list all of the full-time positions that were filled. You have to say what date you filled each position, and then you have to give information on the sources that you use to recruit for these positions. The FCC really wants to see that you're broadly recruiting, right? You're not just hiring your friend or someone you happen to know. And so we always encourage our clients, when you're listing these sources, make sure you have all of the sources that you recruit from, and you're thinking broadly, like a newspaper or LinkedIn or your website or on-air announcements. If you recruit from the local college or university, obviously that would be included as well. For the person you hire, you have to identify which source referred that person. You have to identify how many people you interviewed. And then also, this is a really important one. If you have this list of sources that you're recruiting from, if any of those sources said to you, we want notice of all of your openings, then you have to say that on your report as well. And that's really important because if you get audited, you have to show documentation that you actually did that. So if there's some source, like a local chamber of commerce that says, please tell me anytime you have an opening, and you need to say that on the report and the annual report, but then you also have to make sure that's documented.
And let me just hop in with a comment that if you're dealing with the university HR department, you need to make sure that you're getting that information from the HR department and who they're using, what sources they're using to recruit for these openings, in addition to whatever you might be doing.
Yeah, a lot of our clients will work with the HR department to prepare this annual report. They'll send it to us and then we'll review it and then, give our comments to make sure it has everything that the FCC requires. The other part of the report is on outreach. And so these are, of course, the events that you do with your listeners, with the community. Depending on where you are located, if you're in a big metropolitan area, and then also depending on if you have 5 to 10 full-time employees or more than 10 full-time employees, you may be responsible for 2 or 4 initiatives over the 2 years. So if you have 5 to 10 full-time employees, then you just need to have 2 initiatives over 2 years. If you are located somewhere outside of a metropolitan area of 250,000 or fewer, so you're not, in a big city, same thing, you can have 2 initiatives over 2 years. If you're in a big city or you have more than 10 full-time employees, then you have to do 4 initiatives over 2 years. So these initiatives, the FCC has in their regulation 16 different menu options for what these initiatives can be. We have a template that we always give to our clients, and they list all 16, and we say, look at all of the things that you've done, over the last year, and you want to categorize them into one of these 16. And so that's your way of showing the FCC that you've met these requirements. Maybe you went to 4 job fairs, that counts as 1 initiative. Maybe you hosted a job fair, that counts as 1 initiative. Maybe you have an internship program every semester, that's an initiative for each semester that you have the internship program. And so that's where you're showing the FCC that you are doing this, outreach and really engaging with your community. We know that the FCC has not relaxed these requirements during the pandemic. There's no waiver, you're still responsible for them. What they have said, the staff has said to us, is they're willing to be a little bit flexible in terms of what they consider to count as an initiative. So even before the pandemic, virtual events would count. So we've had a lot of licensees, they do virtual job fairs, that counts. If you do a virtual training with your staff on EEO, harassment training, that would count too. If you're engaging with them on Facebook or on social media in some way, sometimes we're kind of looking for ones for some of the clients that don't do enough. we could also list that one under this sort of particular one of those 16 menu options that talks about engaging online. So I think that's one thing we want to point out too, is that there's no exception just because of the pandemic, but we can try to get some of the engagement you're doing anyway to count as one of these initiatives. Okay. So the reason why all of this matters is because when you're filing your renewal, you have to file what's called the Schedule 396, which is the Broadcast EEO Program Report. This filing actually goes first. We prepare the renewal application and this filing at the same time. But when we file this one first because it generates a file number that we have to actually fill in on the renewal application. So then the FCC knows these two filings go together. We have to attach to this filing the two most recent annual EEO reports. So that's going to be the one you're currently preparing because it's due the same day as the renewal, and then the one from last year. Now, in your online public file, you'll probably have 6 others, right, from the previous years in your license term. The staff is really going to look at these two because these are the two that are attached to this filing. So we have had clients in the past where we looked at their EEO reports and none of them looked great. But what we'll do is we'll say, you really should revise last year's, and then this year's you've got to make sure also looks good. So we won't necessarily say, go back and redo all of them, but let's make the last 2 years really look good and then keep our fingers crossed that the FCC doesn't go back and look at those other ones. The other thing that we include in the 396 is a narrative. And this is, 1 page max, I would say 3 or 4 paragraphs, where you're demonstrating to the FCC that you have achieved broad outreach in the last 2 years. So I write hundreds of these for our clients. It's really nothing too, extensive. You're kind of just summarizing the last 2 years worth of activities. I always advise, or the way I write them is the first part is all about hiring. So I say, we recruited really broadly for all of these positions, including from these sources. And then if you recruited from 40 sources, you just list 7 of them. Pick ones where, they are broad. The newspaper, you made on-air announcements, you posted it on 3 different job search websites, that sort of thing. And then the next part is usually about those outreach initiatives that you're doing. How do you engage in the community? How many job fairs did you go to? How many students or young people did you engage with and talk about broadcast opportunities? Again, the narrative doesn't have to be super long. It's always a page max for our clients. I think it's back to Melody.
Okay, so the EEO and the issues programs lists are obviously the 2 areas of the public file that receive the most FCC scrutiny. But remember that when you're certifying to your online public file, there are other parts of the public file you're also certifying were maintained and that you uploaded things on time. So one of those is the donor list, and this applies to non-commercial stations only. And this is the list of the donors that have contributed for production of specific programs. And it's a rolling 2-year list. So you should have some mechanism for uploading that with regularity. So as we don't know that quarterly is okay. I think that's probably not okay. Some stations do a running list that's monthly. I think that's probably the max amount of time you want to wait because you really should put them up as they come in. This doesn't mean underwriting announcements that were asked to be at a fixed time slot next to a particular program. That's not what's involved. We did hear from the FCC staff, for whatever that's worth. Again, we can't rely on what the staff says because they cannot bind the commissioners. But they think that it relates to local programs as opposed to national programs. But we do see a lot of stations put in local and their NPR or PBS program supporters lists. And that's okay. But if you wanted to just do the local programs, I think that's fine. We don't have any really solid FCC written ruling on that, but that's what the staff was looking at. Of course, that staff person has retired last year, so we're hoping that that's still good advice. Another part of your online public file relates to your contracts. And this is based on a rule that the FCC has about when you're supposed to file contracts. That was a rule that got revised during the media modernization proceedings, where it used to be we had to file the contracts directly with the FCC Secretary's office and keep them in the public file. Now the FCC has revised that rule so that you put it in your public file and you don't actually physically file it with the FCC Secretary's office. But most commonly, what that means is your articles and bylaws, because those are contracts relating to the formation and ownership of the licensee. And also, if you have your PBS membership agreement or membership renewal agreement, network affiliation agreements for TV go in, but not for radio. That's just a little slight difference in the rules. If you had a loan and they were pledge, a pledge document relating to future ownership, those kinds of things would go in there. And then management agreements are also supposed to go on the contracts section. And that's really going to reflect the same documents that are listed in your biennial ownership reports. And it goes in the ownership section of your online public file. There's actually a tab for additional documents, and that's where you would put them. Another section of the public file is political. And hopefully that's no, you had no political, because non-commercial stations are not allowed to sell political time. That doesn't mean someone might not have a legitimate, earnest request for time on your station that you have to say no, in which case you would put a document in your public file that indicated who made the request and for what kind of time, and your disposition, which was no, you did not accept it. The political has not really been an issue for non-coms this year, but every renewal cycle we have something that's like the hot issue. And the political has been the hot issue for commercial, because the commission has gotten all over the fact that the commercial folks weren't putting in their ad requests and buys within immediately. I mean, it needs to go in there immediately because it affects equal opportunities. Because if you did give time to a candidate, you say you didn't sell it, but you allowed them to use the station, all the other candidates who were running against that candidate in that same race would have the opportunity to request equal opportunities. And they have to do that within 7 days of when that aired. So if you got such a request and you allowed it, you would definitely get that in your public file immediately. So that's been the hot subject matter for the FCC this time around. Last renewal cycle, it had to do with minimum operating times, and we'll get to that in a moment. But it's like, what's going to be, and then the time before that, the big surprise was public file documents. So every cycle seems to have some new thing that the staff is interested in.
Melody, there's a question on the chat.
Okay.
And Kurt wants to know if radio program contracts, like contract with NPR, PRI, PRX, AMP, no, those radio does not have to.
Radio network agreements do not go in the public file, only the TV network agreements.
Interesting.
Melody, I just had one thing to add to the contracts. For articles and bylaws, if your licensee is a public entity, like a public university or a federal tribe, we don't need to put the articles of incorporation or bylaws in the folder. So
right. But yeah, sometimes it's a legislative act of Congress that creates the university, so that's a little tricky to try to put that in as a contract. So let's go to the next slide, and this is for KidVid. And you're like, well, why am I talking to you about KidVid? This is a big chunk and the big heaviest lift probably for commercial TV stations. But the FCC changed its rules recently, like a year and a half ago, to provide more flexibility to commercial stations on how they can satisfy their core programming obligations. And the core programming obligations apply to non-commercial TV stations. It's just that non-commercial TV stations don't have to report to the FCC about it. It used to be quarterly reports for the commercial stations. They've now changed that to annual reports. But even so, you have to certify that you met the core programming requirements and the processing guidelines. In the old rule, which was more stringent, it was educational informational programming that was designed to meet the needs of children under 16 and under. That had to be 3 hours a week on average over a 6-month period, and another half hour for every increment of 28 hours on your multicast channels. And core was between 7 and 10, 7 in the morning, 10 at night. It had to be a half hour, and it had to be regularly scheduled. And you had to have the EI symbol, the educational information bug on it. So those, there were more instructions relating to commercials, but still non-commercial stations need to make sure that they are doing at least 3 hours a week for meeting their core programming requirements. And the EI symbol is another certification on the renewal that up until January 20th of 2020, the non-commercial stations also had to have the EI symbol on their core programming, their educational informational kids programming. And that requirement was eliminated, but there's still a certification in the renewal that you did it through that period of time. So there are extensive changes in the definition of core programming. The old rule basically was 3 hours a week on average, a half-hour episodic programming averaged over a 6-month period. If you did that, then you're still good. There's been a little more flexibility added to the rules. You could spend the whole hour on Kids In, and it's not really that relevant to all of you because you've got a lot of PBS Kids programming. But it does, the instructions to the Form 303, the Schedule 303S on this section goes through all of the different varying, slightly nuanced, if it's not on your main channel, you can put some of it on your multicast channels. And if it's not a half an hour, we'll still allow some, not all, but some interstitial and short segments to count as core. So it can get even more complicated trying to figure out, but most PBS stations, for instance, have a lot of kids in, so this is not necessarily going to be a problem, but you do need to certify to compliance. So if we could go to the next slide. And this is, we mentioned already, biennial ownership reports. Biennial ownership reports is a certification on the renewal application that you filed in accordance with the rule. And the rule requires that biennial reports are filed by December 1 each year, effective as of an October 1 snapshot date on odd years. In the prior years, there's been some extensions of those deadlines because of rule changes or because of FCC problems with the form, trying to get the form to accommodate pre-filling, things like that. So there have been sometimes a couple of months of extensions, and I don't think that's going to happen this year, but this year we have to file biennial reports by December 1. But for the purposes of renewals up until December 1, you want to make sure you can certify that the last one was filed so that you can make that certification. We'll go to the next slide. Another certification is a familiar one because it's on all FCC applications. And we normally like to poll our clients' board members. So we usually deal with the general manager and we give them a questionnaire that asks them to send to their trustees because each board member is treated like a party to the application. And you need to have some basis for finding out, did any of them have an adverse finding in connection with a felony or antitrust or unfair competition, fraud on a government agency or discrimination. And there's also the old anti-drug abuse certification from the holdover from the war on drugs legislation a couple of decades ago, where it covers any situation in which someone was convicted of possession or trafficking in which they had a denial of federal benefits as part of their sentencing. So that's on every FCC application, but we always like either with the biennial ownership reports or as part of the renewal process to poll the trustees and board members and officers to make sure that they've had no adverse findings. And then we may need to do an explanation to explain that. It used to be the instructions on the old form for the renewal wouldn't look back beyond 10 years, but the FCC has dropped that from the instructions. So now it would need to be disclosed, but you might be able to explain why the person was rehabilitated and it was older than 10 years, and that's okay. And I have one war story on this, where it was a community licensee that had gotten to me on the eve the renewal was filed and said, oh, we've got this one guy who's had 6 drunk driving convictions, felony drunk driving convictions. But he's dry now, he's clean, he's been going to rehab, you know, he's gone through all of this stuff and he's good. And we'd really like to keep him on our board because he's so important to us. So we went through the extra effort to have an exhibit to explain why we should keep him. And then like 2 weeks later, the general manager calls me up and says, oh, someone saw him drinking. So at that point, we're like, you got to get him off the board and we need to amend. But I don't know you can do that with your trustees. That's a whole different thing. But one thing I would recommend is you talk to your licensees in universities, that you try to get the administration to build into their orientation for their trustees some form of questionnaire relating to these adverse findings and character qualifications, just in case. And we have one like that now with one of our clients where it's a tribe, and you know, these people are elected by the public, and was a felony conviction. So sometimes they get a little tricky to deal with. Let's go to the next slide. There is a question on the form about you have to certify that there have been no violations of the Communications Act or FCC rules during the preceding license term. And if you don't read the instructions, you're going to think that this is self-confession time. Don't do that. You don't have to confess. It's something that came up on your alternative broadcast inspection, where you just know you're operating out of parameters, or you just know that you haven't been airing your EAS test, whatever you think it is. It only applies to FCC written notices of apparent liability, notices of violations, forfeiture orders, or other written FCC or court findings of violations of the Communications Act. So if you don't have any of those, don't put anything in that exhibit and check yes. If you do have those, then we have to disclose them on the renewal. If you check no, and there's an exhibit. Let's go to the next slide. Now, you'll find in the renewal application that there are a whole lot of certifications, and they're kind of new. There's like 6 or 7 questions on alien ownership. And that's because of some changes dealing with the FCC allowing more alien ownership than 20% that's allowed in the statute. And there's all these different waivers and declaratory rulings you could go through, and that's important to the commercial guys. For your purposes, it's really, don't let any more than 20% of your board be non-US citizen. You can have up to 20%. But beyond that, you'll be in violation of the statute, and you would need to take some measures to either, if you're, either have them removed from the board, or if they are, like a trustee of a college or a university, then maybe get them recused and isolated from the station activities and station decisions. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned a moment ago about how operational status was really the big thing that the FCC staff was all over about in the last renewal cycle. And it's because the FCC doesn't believe that, how can you be serving the public interest if you're not even on the air? And it had become a problem where there were a lot of people who were silent for a year. They would go back on for a day, and then they turn back off again. And then they were silent for a year, and then they go back on so that they could stop this cycle of the automatic cancellation of your license if you're silent for more than a year. So there's questions about whether you're currently on the air. So if you're currently on the air, you're fine. If you're not currently on the air, the FCC will not renew you until you're back on the air. There's a question about whether you have been off the air for more than 30 days. So you're going to need to do an exhibit to explain every instance in which you were off the air for more than 30 days. And there's also a question about if you've been off the air for more than a year, in which case, go home because you just lost your license. Unless there's some very extraordinary, extraordinary public interest reason for that. Might be related to the repack and it's a translator that can't find a new home and you've gotten special temporary authority for that and a waiver of the statute for that. So those are the very important things related to operational status. Radio does have minimum operating schedules, but TV stations don't. But the FCC reserves to itself the right to consider whether you were silent a lot. What they have been doing for stations that have been silent a lot is that they might just give them a short-term renewal and see how they act after that. And then one other thing, when you're looking at whether on the radio side, particularly if you've been on the air meeting the minimum operating requirement, is that university student-run stations don't have to be on the air when they're on school break. So weekends, you're not required to be on the air. Summer break, you're not required to be on the air. And so that's a little quirk that's different for student-run stations. And it really came into effect as a question of COVID when the campuses were shut down. So we did have that one-time free pass. So I think I'm going to go to the next slide because we're getting to the point where we want to allow questions. On the environmental, if nothing has happened to change at your site, and there are, on the radio side, there are RF workbooks in the instructions, and if it's only FM at your site, you can use the workbooks to make the certification. But TV can't do it. You would need an engineer to look at it. So usually this comes into play only when there are changes at the site, because otherwise the last time someone filed to license that site or filed a modification facilities for that site, the certification of environmental compliance would have been included in that technical application, and you're allowed to rely on that. But if something has changed nearby, you might want to have, like with other tenants coming on that are not necessarily broadcast tenants, you might want to have your engineer just check and run the RF studies to see whether or not you need to provide an exhibit or if you can just make that certification. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide.
This is me, Melody.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to answer Rachel's question about the comment that I made earlier about the last 2 annual EEO public file reports and how we recommend getting those in as good shape as possible before we attach them to the 396. So what happens is we're in the middle of preparing the current one. And so usually we just counsel our licensees to make sure that that one looks good. If the previous year's needs to be revised, then what we'll do is we'll counsel our clients to revise the report and then just put a note in there that says this report has been amended on advice of counsel, and then to upload that report as amended also to the online public file. So in your EEO public file reports, you'll have the one that you uploaded the previous year on time, and then you'll have the amended report also in there. And so you're showing the FCC that you put it in there on time, but then for the renewal, you've amended. Okay. So for translators, this is just a reminder for the translator that rebroadcasts the primary station, we can list that on the same renewal application. So we always want to make sure we capture all of the translators. If it's a standalone or you're not the licensee of the primary, then we can just do a separate renewal just for the translator.
And just to kind of chime in here on, this is where you can forget that you have translators in another state and that renewal is due an earlier month. Sometimes they get forgotten that you need to file early. And the same thing if they're on a later renewal cycle date, to remember to file them, because you can only use translators on that form that are on the same, that are rebroadcast on the primary, that are in the same renewal cycle, that same renewal month category. So that's just one thing. And also, if you think that there's a problem, maybe if that translator is silent and you don't want it to hold up the renewal of all the other stations, maybe that might be a reason for filing that translator application separately. A little practice tip there.
So the other public file requirements we like to remind licensees of, you make sure the contact information for the profile for the station is up to date. So if you had an address change, you want to make sure that that's reflected in the online public file. Keep the closed captioning contact up to date as well. The FCC automatically imports certain filings. So the renewal application, a couple days after we file, it'll automatically be uploaded to the online public file. They'll also automatically upload the contour map, the public and broadcasting manual, and then any other applications like STAs or anything else that's filed. What we like to recommend is, good public file hygiene. So any applications that have already been granted, you can flip them from in to out. So then they don't show up on your online public file on the public side. For biennials, for example, you only need to have the most recent one showing. And so I actually just looked at an online public file recently, and they had biennials going back to 2001, and there were probably 3 or 4 for each cycle. And so there were just a ton of reports that don't need to be in there. So you can just, when you log in, you just flip it to the out button. And then after the renewal is granted, the FCC will issue a public notice of grant. And 40 days after that, so we usually advise about 6 weeks, barring any adverse action, you can actually remove the issues programs lists, the EEO reports, and the certifications for the local notice of filing. And so that's another time when we say, you can clean out your online public file and your renewal license is starting over, so you start fresh. As another reminder to licensees that are about to file their renewal applications, the homepage of your station's website, this is your own station's website, needs to have a link to the online public file. So that has to be somewhere on the home page. It could be in a dropdown, but it just has to be accessible from the home page directly to the FCC's online public file. You also need to make sure you upload the most recent EEO public file report. So when it's ready, it's been uploaded into the online public file. You also have to upload it to your website. And that doesn't need to be on the home page. But the reason why it matters is because in the 396, there is a certification that says, yes, we have uploaded this report to our website. And then, of course, include the closed captioning contact on your website as well. So I'm going to run through the local notice of filing. These are the requirements that the FCC has for when you're filing your renewal application. You have to announce that that's what you've just done. It used to be that you had to do it before you filed the renewal application. So these pre-filing renewal announcements would air before you actually file, and then you do post after you file. The FCC eliminated the requirement, so now you just do post-filing renewal announcements. You do these over a 4-week period, and the schedule is you have to do at least 1 per week, and then you don't do more than 2 in 1 week, and then you can't do them on the same day, and it has to run between 7 and 11 p.m. Monday through Friday. The timing for when these start is a little tricky, but what we always counsel our clients is when you file, that day that you file, say, in this case, we filed a bunch on June 1, that they were all due that day. About 2 to 3 business days after you file, the FCC will issue a public notice that the application is accepted for filing. That is actually the day after which you have to start running your notices. And you have to do it within 5 business days of that public notice going out. So for us, what we counsel, just to make it simpler, is 4 business days after you file, start running your announcements. So that captures those 2 to 3 business days, but you're still within the 5 business days after. So another reminder is if you file your application on a Monday, I think a lot of people will think, each week you run 1 or 2 announcements, but the week starts the day that you start running them. And so if you filed your application on a Monday and you wait 4 business days, that's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So you run your first announcement on Friday, your week 1 is actually from Friday until the next Thursday. So I know it's a little confusing, but that's how you have to make sure you're timing those announcements correctly. Usually when we help our clients with this, we will just send you
the date you should start running them, and then when your weeks begin. So then you can know you've got to schedule them so that you have one for each of those 4 weeks. And for 2 of those weeks, you're going to run 2. All right, next one. So once you're done running those announcements, and these are on-air announcements for full power stations when you file those renewal applications. There's a separate requirement for translators that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But once those announcements have run, you're going to complete a certification, which is just a form that says this is when each of the 6 announcements ran. You know, your station manager, whoever knows that they ran, signs it. You take the text of the notice and then the certification, and you upload both of those documents into the online public file. The folder is called Local PN Certification, or yeah. So public notice is what that counts for. You have to keep those in there as long as the renewal application is pending. And then that's one of those documents where after the renewal has been granted, 40 days after that, you can remove it. Okay, so for translators, you have to provide online notice. So the way online notice works is it's very similar. The text itself is very similar to the on-air announcements, but whereas the on-air announcements refer you to the station's online public file, translators don't have an online public file. So instead, what you have to do is you have to create a link on the homepage of your own website that says FCC applications. It has to be conspicuous. And then that link has to link to a notice page, and you're going to post the text of what your online notice says on that page. And that text will include a link to the actual application that you just filed. That also goes up 5 business days after you file the renewal. Within 5 business days of the FCC public notice. So again, we counsel do it 4 business days after you file the renewal itself. It has to be up for 30 continuous days. And then when that's finished, you can take down that notice and then you replace it with the statement on the last bullet. There are no pending applications subject to the online posting requirement. Make sure that the page actually has this was the date that the page was last updated. And then we'll do a certification too, where you fill it out and say, these were the dates when the online notice was, posted. And you don't have to send that to anybody, but you keep it for your own records. So then if you ever need to show the FCC that you did it, you have the proof. All right, Melody, it's back to you.
Okay, so just so you understand timing, after you file your renewal application, it's going to be almost 4 months before you find out your renewal is granted, because interested parties have 90 days to file a petition to deny or an objection to the license renewal. So that's why the FCC requires that you file your renewal 4 months before the license expires. But let's say you do get a petition, or let's say the FCC is holding it up because there's been some complaint filed and the Enforcement Bureau hasn't said okay and they want to ask for more information maybe, then they'll put a hold on it. And after like a week or 2 after your license is actually expired, you'll call someone like us and say, why isn't my renewal granted? And then we'll call the FCC and find out what the hold is about. And then we'll find out, I don't know, someone filed an indecency complaint, or someone filed a complaint about a contest or something. So we don't always know that until we ask those questions, because it takes a while. But just rest assured you have continuing authority to operate so long as your renewal application remains pending. So that's the take home message for that. And I think that brings us to, because we already talked about what you could get rid of out of your online public file. So once your renewal is final, which is like 40 days after public notice of the grant of the application, and you can get rid of all those old issues programs lists and those old EEO reports and anything that doesn't have a permanent residency on your public file. So that's it, and we will entertain questions if you have any that we haven't answered so far.
Go ahead, unmute yourselves and speak up.
I was curious, in terms of the annual EEO outreach initiatives, do you, in your perspective, is the CPB required anti-harassment training that we now do for all staff annually, would that qualify to count as an EEO initiative?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
we always encourage people to list that. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
I have a question regarding the quarterly issues. Amy, when you were talking about that, I'm a little confused. Do we have to go back to prior to when they were all put online and put all those online?
Yes. So if your license term began in, say, 2014, or maybe you bought the station in 2016, the FCC didn't require an online public file to go live until 2018. I think it was February 2018. And so despite that, all of those issues, programs lists going back to the beginning of your license term need to be uploaded to the online public file. So occasionally we'll review it and we'll see that, a licensee didn't put that information in there, and we'll just say, you need to make sure you add it.
And that 2018 date is for radio, but it was earlier for television. So that's why we kind of go through the history of when the FCC transitioned certain types of stations.
Oh, the one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about those is we also advise that you create a yearly folder in your issues programs lists folder in the online public file. So you make a folder for each year and then put the lists into that year. I think what happens a lot of times is the FCC is looking for about 31 to 32 lists. And so when they go in there, if they see all the yearly folders and each one of them has 4 files, then a lot of times they won't look. They won't look in the list. They won't look to see what's in there. So what you want to do is just make it really easy. You just show them, look, everything's in there. Looks great. Sometimes we'll run into problems where clients, they'll have like 200 documents in that folder. And so, there's a little bit of discussion about what an issues programs list is and, how we want to make sure that they meet all the requirements. But that's, we just want to make it really easy for the FCC to be like, okay, looks good, moving on.
Okay.
Any other questions for Melody and Amy? There's the contact information. And I will let you know that the PowerPoint and a recording of the webinar will be available on the website early next week. So if you need a refresher, just take a look at the University Station Alliance website and it'll be under the webinars section.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming and for sticking with us. We didn't lose a single person. So Amy and Melody, that means you were right on point. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.